Hello all, and thank you for joining us today as we discuss Barry Jenkins' 2016 Moonlight. After watching this film in class, it seems like all of us have some further questions. I'm Alyssa Alexander, and today I'm here with
Charlotte Walker,
Sierra Spencer,
Evelyn Arnold.
And so to start us off, I'd like to talk about a pattern I noticed this semester. In films we've seen in American masculinities, a common theme has been the connection between violence and sexuality. In Mystic River, the implication of eroticism directly follows scenes that are fraught with violence. There's implied sexuality following the scene where Jimmy and his wife discuss the murders that have occurred in East Buckingham. This goes hand in hand with a scene where Dave and his wife kiss after he comes home and tells her he thinks he killed a mugger. These scenes, however, are painted in a desperate light, which says to me that Eastwood doesn't necessarily appreciate how much violence and sexuality are intertwined. In Moonlight, however, intimacy between Sharon and Kevin is actually followed by violence, which has a profound effect on Sharon. The intimate scene, however, is a vulnerable and meaningful scene, and Jenkins makes it an entirely different argument about the connection between sexuality and violence. What do y'all think the writers and filmmakers we've seen so far would say about the relationship between violence and sexuality as they relate to masculinity?
I definitely think that the filmmakers we've seen so far have definitely made the connection between violence and sexuality very obvious. There have been multiple times where we've seen violence and then directly after seen a scene with extreme sexuality. And a lot of the times we've seen this, it's like in the scenes mentioned by Alyssa from Mystic River. The sexual actions are normally initiated by women. The filmmakers make it seem as if the women view it as hot or sexy when the men commit crimes.
I feel like the relationship that is often portrayed between sexuality and violence is linked in film and human nature, as both of these topics are built with intense feeling and passion, but in the opposite type of spectrums. My hypothesis on why the filmmakers we have studied include this link is because these two topics seem to represent a spectrum of acceptable masculinity that we expect in society. Something that particularly prompted this idea for me was our class discussion about what our final movie should be. From many of the examples proposed, we saw firsthand how both sex and violence is sensationalized, and as a filmmaker wanting to create a large grossing film, it would be wise to include these topics as it sells and appeals to the American public. In The Perfect Man by John F. Kasdan, this desire for a sense of wild freedom as a form of masculine identity is described, and I feel like it explains why these topics are linked and sensationalized in a lot of the films we witnessed this semester.
I think that the relationship between violence and sexuality among men differ in each film. Whereas Clint Eastwood portrays a desperate connection between the two with a dark and troubling aspect of masculinity, and in Moonlight, Barry Jenkins presents a more vulnerable and depthness in intimate scenes, but shows subsequent violence. I think these choices reflect society's view on men being stronger and more powerful in roles of intimacy, and in Mystic River, they portray the women to fawn over powerful men and that it's a turn-on to commit violence, which creates an interpretation to some disturbing and questionable acts of the man and how it is desirable, making masculinity violent but shouldn't be normalized into sex, or the overall stance for all men and women in the acts of sex. I think the directors and writers choose to show this side of men to make other men question oneself's perception of masculinity.
I want to talk about how in Moonlight, we see as Sharon gets older, he tries to almost turn himself into Juan, who he was very close with as he was growing up. We see this in a scene where Sharon is driving his car. His car is very similar to the one driven by Juan. Sharon even has almost the exact same crown on the dashboard as Juan used to have in his car. We even see Sharon resembling Juan in the way he dresses. He wears the gold grills and he covers his head with a do-rag, all in the same way Juan did. When Sharon is an adult, he even goes on to become a drug dealer the same as Juan. How many people would say this is because of the way Juan was the father figure Sharon had growing up? But I think this is because Sharon believes that he can hide his true self if he takes on the same type of masculinity Juan had. I think he believes that if he takes on this tough persona that Juan had, it will mask that he is truly vulnerable and a loving person. What do y'all think? Do you think Sharon follows in the footsteps of Juan because he was the only father figure Sharon ever had? Or do you think it was more because he was trying to mask his true self? And how do you think masculinity takes a role in this?
I think Juan is portrayed as an idealized form of masculinity in Moonlight, not only to the audience, but especially as an ideal portrayal of masculinity to Chiron himself. Since Chiron has many struggles with his identity and what makes him different, His leaning into the role and style of Juan appears as a sort of sense of safety for Chiron as he attempts to emulate what his best representations of masculinity were growing up. I feel like we can also see this sort of phenomenon happen in other films we discussed this semester, such as Citizen Kane, where we slowly watch Charles Kane start to emulate a sort of style and behavior similar to his peers in his career, despite it ultimately leading to his demise. I find the sense of leaning into society ideals and masculinity fascinating, as this trait of hiding one's true self is typically seen as a more effeminate trait in our society today.
It's a really interesting point, and I think it makes perfect sense that Chiron would grow up to be just like his father figure, but I think that Chiron following in Juan's footsteps isn't so much masking his true self, but is more reflective of him realizing what it takes to be successful in his community and attempting to emulate that just to feel secure. Like Charlotte said, Juan is one of the only people in Chiron's life that's able to protect him in any way. Juan is financially stable, he has a safe home for Chiron to visit, and affirms Chiron during their discussion about being gay. Of course Chiron would want to grow up to be just like him. But I also feel some elements of mise-en-scène do indicate that this persona that they've both built isn't necessarily who they are, but a protective mask. In the scene where adult Chiron is being vulnerable with Teresa or with Kevin, he often isn't wearing his telltale gold grill that he wears in public, showing that he isn't wearing his usual quote-unquote armor, which is the same armor that his father figure, Juan, wore. I noticed that when Juan took little Chiron to the water to float, he also wasn't wearing his grill. Both adult Chiron and Juan are only vulnerable with their loved ones in private, and put on a face to the world of a hard and tough guy. So I think maybe the answer is a little bit of both.
Yeah, I believe Juan had a significant role in Chiron's adult personality in life, not just because he was a father figure, but also the first connection he had that created safety and a role model. When creeping up on the ages of adulthood, I think it creates a shift in the question of who we want to be, or for Chiron, what kind of man he wants to be. To have Juan as that role model that of the only male adult he can remember, he's following what he knows. I also think Chiron has had trouble in adolescence to find and express himself fully, and to even accept his sexuality, so I don't ever find him masking himself, just unknown of himself, especially under the influence of bullying and a rough family life. I believe his portrayal of masculinity develops from quiet and hidden to a confident and strong with the influences of Juan. With these influences, it teaches him to be vulnerable in the right moments with the right people.
In Moonlight, we see Chiron fall into a sort of gangster stereotype when following in the footsteps of Juan, despite the numerous other ways we watch him break this stereotype, namely with his sexuality. The use of stereotyping in film is ever present and seems to have many conventional uses. We also see specific stereotypes with characters such as the Tramp in modern times, starring Charlie Chaplin, and Charles Kane as the anti-hero in Citizen Kane. How can it be important to stereotype a character in a film, and what does it say about the portrayal of masculinity of a specific character? Is it important to avoid these cliches, or do they add necessary substance when telling the story of a character? When is it essential to break the mold of a stereotype, and when have we seen that done in the films we have studied this semester already?
I think it can be important depending on the film you're watching, but I also think it can hurt how you view the film as a whole, or it can change whether or not you may like the film. I think when we stereotype a character, we expect to see a certain type of masculinity, and when we don't, it is almost as if we get disappointed or upset that the character does not truly and completely fit the stereotype we expected them to. Again, when we think about whether we should avoid putting characters into a stereotype, I think we have to think about whether or not this is what the film was expecting us to do. Like in Moonlight, the filmmakers expected us to put Chiron into this gangster stereotype just to surprise us when they show us his vulnerable and emotional side. I think this was trying to show us that just because someone is acting a certain way does not mean that they always fit into that stereotype, that it looks like they do. I think it is essential to break away from stereotypes you were put into or that you might be put into. I think the major example is Chiron in Moonlight, because not only does he break away from the gangster stereotype in the way of his sexuality, but we also see him break away from that tough persona that most people put into the gangster stereotype. We see him carry a more vulnerable and emotional side than most gangsters.
Well, so I think, as per a lot of our discussions earlier this semester, Moonlight is really different compared to films that we consider its predecessors, movies like Boys in the Hood and Menace to Society. These films contain similar tropes to Moonlight, with the setting being lower income communities that deal with a lot of crime and drugs. But I agree with Sierra to some extent that the point of the film is to show Sharon's interior emotional journey. And I think the presence of cliches honestly really only drives that point home more strongly. The fact that Juan is a drug dealer that doesn't sell in the community he lives in, combined with the fact that he's also the first person to affirm Sharon's questions about homosexuality, makes the plot more complex, and it really brings the characters to life, rather than just being a stereotype that plays in the background. It's also important to the plot that Sharon's mother is struggling with addiction, as it affects Sharon. However, my caveat to this statement that stereotypes are necessary to the plot of Moonlight is that it is because these stereotypes are not the main point and are only used to create depth of character that these cliches are done, quote unquote, well. If the cliches were used to convey the entirety of the character and there was no twist or no perturbation from standard usage of the cliche, it would be honestly really hard to make the argument for necessity. For example, the film The Help has been greatly criticized in recent years, especially after 2020, for playing into stereotypes that didn't necessarily help advance the plot, and it used cliches like the white savior narrative without breaking them. Thus, to me it seems that cliches should be on a case-by-case basis. In all, for Sharon, it's more revolutionary to have his character be a gangster that comes to terms with his sexuality, rather than for him to fall into the stereotype of characters trying to leave behind their childhood community to, embrace their sexuality and who they really are, which kind of paints the place they were raised as behind the times.
I think stereotyping a character in a film can serve many purposes of providing viewers with a quick and recognizable cue about a character's traits or background. It can be important for the storytelling efficiency, especially in films with limited time to introduce and develop a character. But in terms of masculinity, it can perpetuate narrow and unrealistic ideas of what it means to be a man. Characters that show more stereotypically characteristics tend to lack depth or complexity that limits true portrayal of masculinity. What I like about Moonlight is the subtlety they portray in Chiron and Kevin's relationship and sexuality, because it draws the audience in and has a true representation of how it is for young men dealing with accepting their sexuality. In Moonlight, we watch Chiron grow up through different stages of life: a child, teenager, then adult. When Chiron is a child, he meets Juan, who is the closest to what he has as a father figure since his father is out the picture. Chiron is seen to be super closed off and in his own head for most of his adolescence, but Juan gives him a space to be open to himself and the world. After Juan's death, Chiron still carries the idea of him into adulthood. As an adult, he becomes a semi-confident gangster and is perceived to be stronger than ever. He also becomes comfortable with the ideas of his sexuality and personality. In the film Boyhood, we follow the same stages of life in a young boy named Mason. Mason's parents are divorced, so that his father is pretty absent in his day-to-day life beside visitation. When he's a teenager, his mom gets remarried to an abusive alcoholic that keeps the household on edge. Eventually, his mother leaves him and moves away for their safety. But as Mason starts approaching graduating high school, he begins to have a tighter bond with his actual father. This leads Mason to live a vulnerable life in college and use these connections to find himself. Both Chiron and Mason differ in father figures, but both have different outlooks on masculinity and discovering what kind of man they want to be in their adult lives. What are the effects of having a father figure throughout childhood on how the characters perceive masculinity as an adult compared to their adolescence?
The presence of a father figure is seemingly important to how a growing boy develops, and it can be a major influence towards a boy's personal representation of masculinity. I do think that Chiron put on a harder exterior, which we were able to see from the mise-en-scène of his costuming and the settings and objects surrounding him, such as the car. But I think this hard exterior is not just a product of Chiron's father figure Juan, but also the need to hide the more sensitive parts of himself that he may have perceived as a weakness. I think that it also begins to beg the question of when a father figure is really important for developing a man's masculinity in film and when it isn't necessary to have a father figure. In both circumstances, is it possible for the character to have the same outcome?
I think having a father figure has a lot to do with masculinity, especially when it comes to characters in films. When we look at Chiron, it is nobody but him and his mother, so he has to be like the man of the house, causing him to believe that he can't be vulnerable and that he can't be who he truly is. But this changes when Juan comes into his life, because he is able to see how Juan acts and handles himself out in the streets, but then also how he acts almost like a completely different person when he is home with the woman he loves. This shows Sharon that he can be vulnerable and tough, that you don't just have to be one or the other. I also think when you're comparing adolescence to adulthood, we can see how when in adolescence, you are generally more vulnerable to the influence, and I think that we see that a lot with Sharon. Juan came into Sharon's life when he was still an adolescent, and this caused him to be more influenced by Juan. This caused Sharon to try to become the same person as Juan.
I totally agree with everything that's been said so far, and I would actually like to extend the question. It seems really clear to me that having an unstable relationship with your father would lead to issues later in life with perceiving masculinity. I'm curious about what the role of being a father would play in viewing masculinity. In the way that Charlotte mentions that Sharon is affected by Juan's presence, it seems that Juan is softened by Sharon. In the scene where Juan catches Sharon's mother doing drugs, both him and Paula realize that while they both love Sharon, they also both have a relationship with drugs that makes them unable to provide something for Sharon. For Paula, drugs stop her from being a loving mother, and for Juan, he realizes that while he may be Sharon's father figure, it comes at the cost of knowing it takes worsening Paula's drug addiction to be able to stay in his position of power.
Well, I think a lot of really good points have been made today, and definitely having this conversation about masculinity that we've seen this semester and within Moonlight itself and the questions we've gained this semester has really been enlightening, and it makes me interested to see where we'll continue to go in our journey of learning about masculinity. Thank you all for coming today.
Thank you.